Unlike the rest of the panel, I don't come at this from a resilience perspective, but I come more from a surveillance perspective, working on the Food Security Nutrition Surveillance Project in Bangladesh. So that's how I approached this presentation, and trying to think of how we can incorporate more resilience measurement into existing surveillance projects. So there are three commonly noted reasons for surveillance. One is to support long-term aid in planning. The second is to assist in the monitoring and impact assessment of programs. And the third is early warning. Unfortunately, these three goals don't always fit easily together in one surveillance system. Moreover, you can accomplish these goals without enabling us to measure resilience. And the measurement of resilience, unless it's done carefully, could also inhibit the ability of a system to accomplish these other objectives. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to illustrate this example using the HKI model that's been in Bangladesh to try and problematize some systems that have been proposed. So in 1990, Helen Keller International, along with the Institute of Public Health, began a surveillance system in Bangladesh. This surveillance system relied on sentinel site subdistricts and locally recruited data collectors who would collect data very frequently, 6 times a year. Originally, it was started with 8 surveillance subdistricts, and over the years, between 1990 and 1997, this increased. This system would have been a good model for measuring resilience had we been undertaking it now and not in the early 90s when the idea of resilience hadn't really blossomed. However, this system didn't last. It changed. First in 1998, where the idea of sentinel subdistricts was retained, but where those subdistricts were located was decided to be equally spread across Bangladesh instead of in the food and nutrition insecure areas. And then the second time is when nutrition and food security surveillance was restarted in Bangladesh in 2010 with funding from the European Union. The system of sampling was completely changed into something kind of like repeated sample surveys. So why did this happen? Well, both changes were due to a push from in-country stakeholders for data collection that was representative of the country as a whole and administrative areas, if possible, because these are the units through which planning was done. So these changes did improve the representation of the system, and they also helped its ability to assist in long-term countrywide planning and also to help with the impact assessments of national and subnational programs, such as the multi-year assistance projects that happened at that time and also the National Nutrition Program. However, this focus completely reduced the ability of the system to measure shocks and resilience to shocks. So as we really would like to measure resilience, as it's an end goal of development, we need to try and better understand how we can balance risks when designing a surveillance system so that the system will be able to accomplish these multiple goals. How can we do this? Well, I'm going to be a little controversial and spice things up and say that I don't necessarily agree with a system that overly relies on sentinel sites. And I have 2 main reasons. The first off, there are survey effects. People change in response to repeated questioning. And this, interestingly, doesn't limit itself just to qualitative type measures. Last year, a study from MSF surveillance data in northern Nigeria showed that when the same villages were repeatedly visited for acute malnutrition surveillance, the communities that were visited more often had less acute malnutrition. And secondly, I'm concerned that sentinel sites will not lead to large-scale programming. We don't just want to know about resilience. We want to know about resilience so we can act. And in that, more representative systems will encourage large-scale intervention, while sentinel sites are more likely to encourage either small-scale randomized controlled trials, that kind of intervention, or are to encourage no intervention at all, since you want the surveillance site to maintain its representativeness as an element of the country and not become different than that country due to frequent interventions. So what can we do? How can we move ahead? Well, I have 4 little recommendations, which I'm sure could be expanded on. So one is that I think we should include more robust analysis of the data we already have. Yesterday, in a presentation on measuring resilience in the Horn of Africa, simulation models were introduced, which I think could be very useful for measuring the possible resilience impacts of projected programming. Another important aspect is we can use rotational design more wisely. Frequent surveys and panel surveys doesn't mean that we have to interview the same households or the same communities each round. We can do something similar to cross-sectional surveys, but revisit at an extended period and therefore maybe reduce the risk of survey effects. course, this will also have to be weighed against the risk of non-response or inability to follow up households. But still, we can try and mix and match a system that will have us visiting individual households and communities less frequently, but still getting some form of panel data. Thirdly, we can try to include local level staff in a surveillance system for that thin data that we need to collect. And this can be validated by external staff who can collect the thick information as well as make sure that that thin information is being collected correctly. And they could do this as part of their normal job. Both of these last two elements are something that FSNSP is either trying to implement now or trying to implement in its next phase. And finally, I think we need to catalyze a greater understanding of the importance of resilience to policy and program planners, so that when we tell them that we're changing the surveillance system in order to accomplish this, they understand why we're doing it and can accept the trade-offs that must come from that. Thank you.
Excellent. A sense of how you've created demand, how the data have been used, and especially for informing emergency response decisions, as I understand was one of the purposes.
Yeah, I mean, luckily for me, a lot of the demand was created before my time in the 90s. But because of the frequency of disaster in the early 90s, and also because of the use of the system, especially for program planning, there is a lot of demand in Bangladesh for data in general. And for this system in particular, like I said in my presentation, it's been important in evaluating the NNP, which was a national project, in addition to the flood response in '98. Back when the original NSP was running, whenever there was a disaster, usually those teams were mobilized in order to collect additional information so that the subsequent intervention could be planned.